I'd love to hear from you on the show. We were talking about floods and emergency planning in the first part of the programme this morning on the Burnsy Show. We're going to talk about floods now, but we're going to talk about floods that happened 600 years ago. A man who used to work here, I'm told he's a former BBC Radio Humberside producer, has written a book about floods 600 years ago. His name is John Withington, and he's on the line now, or he's somewhere in a studio in the country. John, morning to you.
Good morning. Good to be on Radio Humberside again.
Yeah, when were you a producer here?
I was there for the first day, so I started in 1971 and I left in 1973.
Wow, what was that first day like?
I can't really remember. I was the sports editor and the news producer, but the big thing I do remember about the early days was that Hull City were involved in a very exciting promotion battle. Unfortunately, it didn't quite get promotion, but I think that at the time was the closest they'd ever got to the top flight.
Ah, right, okay. So you can't remember, well, it'd be about 40-odd years ago now, but here you are writing about a book about events, 600 years ago?
Yeah, even before my time.
Tell me about it, John. What's the book about?
Well, the book is called Flood, Nature and Culture, and so it looks at a number of aspects of floods. So, as you mentioned, historic floods, but also floods in religion. Many religions have flood stories, like the story of Noah. It talks about how authors have described floods, how painters have depicted them, how floods have appeared in films. It talks about the dramatic earthworks and so on that human beings have made to try to fight floods, and it talks about the future of flooding.
Right, okay. Why are you so fascinated by floods?
Somebody asked me to write the book.
Right, okay, fair enough.
I'm a disaster historian.
Ka-ching, is it? Ka-ching.
I wish it were.
Right.
I write books on the history of disasters, so somebody very kindly approached me to write this book about floods, and I was delighted to do it.
And you're looking at the future of floods. Get your crystal ball out. What are you predicting here, John?
Well, you probably know there was an official report that warned that the Humber might rise something like 30 inches by the year 2080.
Mm-hmm.
And if that were to happen, I think the figure that I saw quoted was that perhaps 300,000 homes and businesses might be affected. So obviously global warming is one of the things that I do look at. And it's not just global warming, of course, because as human beings have got more numerous and as we've accumulated more possessions, if floods do happen more often, we've got more people to be damaged and more possessions to be damaged.
Have we learned, because as you say, you've based it in history but still looking at the future, have we learned the lessons of the past?
Well, you might say not always. There's a lot of concern in this country, as you know, about building on floodplains.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose if we look at the floods in Thailand in 2011, people will remember television pictures of those, some of the worst floods Thailand had ever experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons they were so devastating is that the area they had devastated had previously been used as a kind of safety valve for the river. But in previous years, they built industrial estates, factories on those regions, and so they were much more severely damaged. So with so many human beings, there were 2.5 billion human beings in 1950. There are 3 times that number now. You've got to put them somewhere.
What's the most surprising thing that you found out when you were doing your research and writing the book?
Well, I suppose one thing that struck me was that there always have been devastating floods. And you've got to be a bit cautious if you're going to say that everything's going to be worse in the future, because the worst natural disaster ever was a flood. That was a flood in 1931 of the Yellow River and Yangtze rivers in China, killed about 3.75 million people, if you include those drowned, but also those who starved to death or died of disease in the aftermath. And then the second worst natural disaster ever was another flood of the Yellow River in China, 1887, killed 2.5 million people. So floods have always been with us, and they are the natural disaster most commonly suffered by humanity.
Okay, and you write about a flood that affected the Humber 600 odd years ago.
That's right, January the 15th, 1362. It was a flood that devastated not just the Humber area, also devastated northern Europe. But from the Humber point of view, there was a port called Ravenser Odd, which was at the mouth of the Humber, where Spurn Point is now. And that was finally wiped off the map in 1362. And it's apparently been quite a prosperous place. It's been found in the 13th century, it was important enough to send soldiers and ships to join the king's forces when we fought against the Scots. It had got a market, the port was used by 100 merchant ships a year, but during the 14th century it started to suffer from erosion, and then in 1362 it finally went under the waters.
Okay, just a reminder, John, what's the book called?
The book's called Flood, Nature and Culture, published by Reaction Books.
Nice to talk to you, John. Thank you very much. There you go, John Withington, who was one of the original staff here at BBC Radio Humberside. This in from Rachel